The last class we talked about there is a great law according to that even one atom is not wasted. There is no spot in the universe where life is not there. And the breathing of all the beings is going on uninterrupted. Can we ever imagine that being, that capital BEING, that ultimate being, is crowded upon, that ultimate being has crowded every leaf? If that be so, can we say he is not there or is absent from the immensities of space? So we can see his influence on every leaf. That's what it meant. So can we say that he is absent from the immensities of space? Or can we say space is infinite, all right, but it is alone? It is waste, lifeless, is less useful to the one design or out of the various designs of the universal being. There's nothing we can say like that. Nothing is waste, nothing is lifeless. Everything is full of that universal being's spirit and life. Now we'll start. When life is there on the leaf which we are talking about, when there is life on that leaf which we are talking about, and the microscope shows other creatures living off the leaf. When the life is there on the leaf and the microscope examination shows other creatures living off the leaf. That means there are small insects or something which is there resting on that leaf and trying to make that leaf into an avenue to live. So when life is there on the leaf and the microscopic examination shows the other creatures living off the leaf, that there are other creatures living, making that leaf as a food, and we don't have an instrument to discover the nobler and more gifted things and beings that are hovering on the illimitable air. Illimitable means unlimited. That's another way of expressing air which is not limited. So, Madam is talking about other creatures which are forming part on the leaf, and microscopic examination is showing the other creatures are living on the leaf, and other creatures are using the leaf and the contents of the leaf as their food. And we have a microscope to examine what is there on the leaf, but she says we don't have an instrument to discover the nobler and more gifted things or beings that are hovering on the illimitable air. We're able to see what is there on the leaf because we have a microscope, but we don't have any other instrument which can show us what are all the beings which are available just over the space where we are sitting, hovering on the illimitable air. Limit, illimitable air. That's the expression she has used, not unlimited. She says illimitable air, air which has no limits. And then she says man has affinity. Man has affinity with all these forms, which is very mysterious, she says. Man is connected to all these life forms, and we are not able to see the gifted beings that are hovering on the illimitable air, air which has no limits. And man has affinity with all these life forms, which is very mysterious. And to break the barriers and understand more of this life and life force, our soul has to be filled with a lot of enthusiasm, intense enthusiasm, so that one can listen to the voice of their eternal life. This is what she is saying. To break the barriers. There are barriers which are dividing or which are the obstacles for us to understand what exactly the life is all about. So to break the barriers, understand more of this life and life force, our soul has to be filled with a lot of enthusiasm, intense enthusiasm, so that one can listen to the voice of that eternal life. So only when we have that sort of enthusiasm, which is intense enthusiasm, to know what is there in the life forms which are available and the life force which is available in the life forms, then it is the soul which has to be filled, she says. The soul has to be filled with a lot of enthusiasm. So it's something which we will have to perhaps understand with our higher principle, not with mind or anything like that. So it is the soul which has to be filled with a lot of enthusiasm, intense enthusiasm, so that one can listen to the voice of the eternal life. There is a voice for the eternal life. There is a sound which you can hear, provided our souls are filled with that enthusiasm, which will break all the barriers so we can understand the nature of the true living beings or all life forms and all life force. To do this, what exactly man has to do? Man should be, and his soul should be free of earthly desires. Man should be, and his soul should be free of earthly desires. Only then it's possible to look at all the forms and also listen to the eternal voice. So man should be, and his soul should be free of earthly desires. So there are no desires which are normally that are being enjoyed or that are being satisfied on the earth. So all these things have to go for us to understand or for us to hear, for us to understand the life forms, the life force, and also enable us to listen to that voice of the eternal life. So thus prepared, then science can be relied upon to help man's sight, then will be able to see. So when this thing is happening, when the soul is free of all the earthly desires and the eternal life's voice is audible, and one is able to see all the life forms, life force. If you prepare that way, one can see through science. Science also can be relied upon to help man. So man's sight then will be, man's sight means man's way of looking at things will be able to see all life forms which are subtler, subtle. Subtle means very thin, not very conspicuous. All life forms which are subtler, the nervous system will get ready to capture all the vibrations of life. The most important, spirit will become more alive and active. So man, when he's ready, when sight improves, the way he has to look at these life forms, it will improve, provided he lets go all these earthly desires. Then science also will help him to find out what are all these life forms, and his sight then will be able to see, man's sight then will be able to see all life forms which are subtler, and the nervous system will get ready to capture all the vibrations of life. So not only see the subtler forms, but the nervous system of his body that will be able to capture the vibrations of all the life around. The most important, spirit will become more alive. So what is spirit in us? What is the Chetanatva in us, Chaitanya in us? That will become very active, alive. And that's the result of losing or working out of the earthly desires. What happens when the earthly desires disappear is that the man becomes capable of seeing all life forms which are subtler, and his nervous system, because he has no longer anything else to spend his energy on. So that nervous system is completely available for him to capture all the vibrations of life. The most importantly, what also happens is the spirit will become more alive and active. The spirit which is living in man, it becomes more active and alive to capture all the nuances of life, all the nuances of life. Air and space will be full of life, and all the secrets of higher chemistry of nature will become palpable and clear. Air and the space. Air is one thing, above that is ether, and we have space. So there are three divisions there: the air, the ether, and the space. Air and space will be full of life, and all the secrets of higher chemistry of nature will become palpable and clear. Palpable is something I believe actually the meaning is, I perhaps gave a wrong meaning last time. Palatable is perhaps what I gave. It is palpable, means I can touch it, I can feel it. So that is palpable. Impalpable means I cannot touch it. The last time, last class, we used this expression impalpable, means I cannot touch that. So this is palpable, means I can feel it, I can touch it. That's what he's saying. Air and space will be full of life, and all the secrets of higher chemistry of nature will become palpable and clear. So, how all these nature is made of, what are the components which are there, what are the compounds which are all there in nature, all those secrets of nature also will become palpable, means obvious. You can even feel them and they become very clear. That's what it is said. All this is not magic. All this is not magic, as some people call it, but it is science, intelligent application of science, which has thrown the doors open for us to see and understand and utilize the power of nature. So, normally, what we don't understand, what we don't easily understand, we call it magic. So, that magic is something which we have been talking about in this book, The Isis Unveiled. And she says, all this is not magic. This is not magic. This is actual science. People normally call it as magic, but it is science. Intelligent application of science, which has thrown the doors open for us to see and understand. So the science has made it possible for all the doors to open, all the obstacles to be removed, all the doors are open for us to see and understand and utilize the power of nature. So we can understand the power of nature. We can also make use of that power of nature. That's what he says, what she says. So the most important thing which we have covered here is that we don't have an instrument to discover the beings which are hovering around us, maybe floating over and above us. But that's happening in this illimitable air which has no limits. And man has affinity with all these life forms. Man has affinity with all these life forms, means that he has got that ability to get along with those forms. So he has the affinity, means he has that affection sort of thing, or he's able to identify with those forms. And this is mysterious. This is what she's saying is mysterious about it. Man has affinity with all these life forms, which is mysterious. And he has terrible affinity. That's exactly how it is written in the book. He has terrible affinity, means affinity which is very strong. To break the barriers and understand more of this life, the life which is hovering around you, over you in the air, to break the barriers and understand more of this life and life force, our soul has to be filled with a lot of enthusiasm, intense enthusiasm. Unless you are ready to see, unless you have got the ability to see, unless you have got that power which you ardently wish, and that enthusiasm, if it is there, the soul, if it is filled with that sort of enthusiasm, intense enthusiasm, then all these life forces are visible. And then she also says, so that one can listen to the voice of the eternal life. The eternal life's voice can be heard when this happens. To break the barriers and understand more of this life and life force, our soul has to be filled with a lot of enthusiasm, intense enthusiasm, so that one can listen to the voice of the eternal life. Man should be, and his soul should be, free of earthly desires. This is what is required for anything, for any sadhana, for anything which you want to see, the higher things. What we can see perhaps with all these earthly desires is something which is physical, what we see on the earth. But if one is getting rid of the earthly desires, maybe the eyes and doors are open to see the other forms, other life forms. Thus prepared, then science can be relied upon to help So science will help at that point of time when the earthly desires are not there. Man's sight then will be able to see all life forms which are subtler. The nervous system will be able to capture all the vibrations of life. And the most important, spirit, that spirit also will become more alive and active. These are all the changes which take place when the earthly desires have gone. He is able to see all the life forms. Even the subtler life forms he is able to see. The nervous system also is responding to the vibrations of life. And the most important, spirit, the spirit which is in man, that will become more alive and active because it is not pulled down by the earthly desires. The spirit is active, it's going up, so it's active. So air and space will be full of life. The air, illimitable air, which is talked about, air and space will be full of life, and all the secrets of higher chemistry of nature will become palpable and clear. So all the secrets of nature, all the compounds which are involved in the nature, all the components of nature, the chemistry between those compounds, everything will become very clear and feelable. One can touch or one can perhaps understand as if he is touching. That is palpable. All this is not magic, as some people call it, but is science, intelligent application of science, which has thrown the doors open for us to see and understand and utilize the power of nature. So the power of nature has to be harnessed and used well, again, not for selfish purposes, but for the welfare of all. So this is how the powers of nature also have to be used. We are told that there are millions of beings, not actually spirits. That means they are beings, all right, but they don't have the spirit in them. Like we have spirit and matter in them, they are not having spirit in them. Maybe they're only some matter which is floating around, though they are made of some matter. All those beings which are there, millions of beings, not actually spirits, though they are not, though they are made of some matter is the basis on which those beings have formed, and it is not having any spirit within it. So we are told that there are millions of such beings which are not made of spirit, but they're made of some matter. We cannot see them with this naked eye. We cannot see them with this naked eye. The matter with which these beings are formed is matter so delicate and subtle. So the matter with which these beings are formed is matter so delicate and subtle, as if a thin rubber film is coated on them. As if a thin rubber film is coated on them. The word used is gossamer, Gossammer, also meaning a thin rubber-like substance, rubber-like substance. Gossamer is a thin rubber-like substance which covers the being. So the being is covered, the being is there, it's made of some matter, but that matter also we're not able to see with the naked eye. The reason being, it is made of some filmy material, filmy in the sense, some thin material that is coated on them. There is gossamer, which is a thin rubber-like substance which covers the being. Some of these beings are wise, some are of harming nature, some hostile, cruel to men. So again, these beings, some of them are very wise, some are harming nature, and some hostile and cruel to men. So all sorts of creatures are there. We're not able to see them, but there is a rubber-like substance covering them. We cannot see them with our naked eye, but then they're all there. And some spirits or some beings, I'm calling spirits wrongly, some beings are wise, some beings are harming nature, some are hostile, some are cruel to men. Some act as messengers between earth and heaven. Some act as messengers between earth and heaven. So this is the various beings which are floating around, which we are not able to see, which we can see provided we are filled with enthusiasm and we break all the barriers. We can also even listen to the vibrations because our nerves can respond to the vibrations when no longer earthly desires are there in our system. Sir Bulwer Lytton. Sir is knighted. So Sir Bulwer Lytton, Bulwerlytton. He, in his book Zanoni, gave a sketch of all about these elemental beings. Sir Bulwer Lytton, in his book Zanoni, Zanoni, gave a sketch of all about these elemental beings, which are not of spirit, made of some matter, which was already explained to us in the previous paragraph. Again, Lytton is also saying the same thing. Bulwer Lytton is also saying the same thing in his book. Gave a sketch of all about these elemental beings, which are not of spirit. They are not made of spirit, but they are made of some matter. The general public felt that Sir Bulwer Lytton knew even much more than what he revealed. So he did not perhaps give all the details of that book, but people felt, the general public felt, Sir Bulwer Lytton did not write all that he knew about these elemental beings. So he did mention that they are made of a different matter, they are not of spirit, but he didn't reveal many details, is what it is recorded here. Sir Bulwer Lytton. He wrote a book called Zanoni. It all described or gave a sketch of these elemental beings about whom we have read. Some helpful, some not so helpful, some cruel, and some which will form as a bridge between earth and heaven. So that sort of beings, elemental beings, they're not made of spirit, but they're made of some other matter. So the general public felt that Bulwer Lytton knew even much more than what he revealed. Now HPP goes to talk about Plato and the speculations in the symposium on the birth or creation of primordial men. This is another subject she's going into. This is the problem with this book. We keep on changing from one topic to another topic. We just heard of elemental beings, how the beings are hovering around us, but we're not able to see them. They are made of matter, all right, but they are made of such thin matter, our naked eyes are not able to see. That information she has given. She has also added the information given by Sir Bulwer Lytton. Then now she says, HPP goes to talk now about Plato and the speculations. Speculations means what the mind says, what the mind is able to project. That is speculation. In the symposium, that he used to entertain a lot of dialogues with his disciples and others. So in his symposium on the birth or creation of primordial man. Primordial means very early, very basic and very early period men. There is a book he wrote, Timaeus, Themis, but there is E in between, Timaeus, Themis, where he did talk and mention about cosmogony. So he did talk about how the universe came into being. So that's what he's referring to, that book which he wrote, Themis, where he did talk and mention about cosmogony. These words must be taken allegorically. This is what Madam is saying. These words which he has given, they must be taken as allegorical. Allegorical, you know the meaning. They appear as one thing, but there is another meaning within the meaning which we understand. So that's allegory. Allegory is not told straight, but then told in a form of maybe a story, maybe in terms of some description. When you understand the description literally, that is not what it means, but there is some other meaning behind it. So these words must be taken allegorically if one wants to accept them. If one wants to accept them, they have to be understood as allegorical. Plato and Neoplatonists means people who followed Plato later on. Plato and Neoplatonists expounded the theory proposed by Pythagoras. So it was Pythagoras who proposed the theory. Plato and Neoplatonists expounded the theory proposed by Pythagoras. What did they say? God is the universal mind. This is what Pythagoras said. And Plato and Plato's disciples also expounded the theory, means they also went with the theory proposed by Pythagoras. Pythagoras said, God is the universal mind diffused through all things, and he also added the dogma about the soul's immortality. So he has added two things. Pythagoras says, first, God is the universal mind diffused through all things. So he is there everywhere. The mind is present everywhere, in everything. And he also added the dogma about the soul's immortality. Why do they say dogma? You have to believe is perhaps what he felt. So he also added the dogma about the soul's immortality. Soul is immortal, it means it has no death. That's what he said. Teachings were not derivative. Teachings were not derivative. Derivative is there is a sequence in which it is arranged. If by going through one and reading the second, reading the third, we'll understand it very, very clearly. But they are not arranged derivatively, means they are one thing here, another thing in some other place, third thing in different place, like that. So teachings were not derivative, but incongruous, not only derivative, not in harmony with the subject. Incongruous means they're not going with the subject. Incongruous, not in harmony with the subject. Plato was piety and had great veneration for the mysteries. Now, talking about Plato, all this is Pythagoras on top. God is the universal mind diffused through all things, and he also added the dogma about the soul's immortality. All that was Pythagoras' words, which were accepted by Plato and Neoplatonists. And the teachings were not derivative, is again the comment made by those people. Teachings were not derivative, is what Plato and Plato's disciples or Neoplatonists talked about. But incongruous, not in harmony with the subject. So they were perhaps mentioned not in derivative fashion, not in harmony with the subject which was being discussed. Plato was piety and had great veneration for the mysteries. Plato had this piety, means pious. The attitude towards the mysteries was very pious. Plato's attitude towards the mysteries was very pious and had great veneration, means great admiration for the mysteries. He had deep sense of responsibility and did not become a victim of indiscretion. So he did accept them, read them, understood them with a lot of responsibility, and did not become a victim of indiscretion, means he understood them thoroughly and then he put it onto the paper, saying this is what is meant. So he was not in a hurry to say something and then say, no, this is not what I meant. So for the mysteries, he had veneration, respect, and he had deep sense of responsibility and did not become a victim of indiscretion. Indiscretion is not using your discretion properly. So he did not become a victim of indiscretion. He behaved like an adept. Plato, it is said, he behaved like an adept. Adept is someone who has reached a stage where there is complete wisdom. So he behaved like an adept and did not let go or publicize the secrets of the mysteries. So he took care of the mysteries, he understood the mysteries, he took care to see that no indiscretion was there in trying to publish anything, any relative information about those mysteries. Not only that, he behaved towards them like an adept behaves, with a lot of care. He did not reveal things which need not be revealed. So, and did not let go or publicize the secrets of the mysteries of what he came across. So he was very careful. Plato was very careful. He was unhappy that the secrecy about the mysteries was not maintained, less secrecy observed by his peers. So this is always the problem with one person believes that secrecy is very important. The other person says it can be made open. So he was quite unhappy because secrecy about the mysteries was not maintained. Less secrecy observed by others. Constantly perfecting himself in perfect mysteries, a man in them alone becomes truly perfect. This is the quotation of Paedrus, Paedrus. So this is what Paedrus said: constantly perfecting himself in perfect mysteries. Means man trying to understand the mysteries perfectly and in the process becoming perfect and understanding everything, then that man alone can become truly perfect. That's the meaning of that particular quotation, which is playing with the words perfecting. So it is very confusing when you read it for the first time. Constantly perfecting himself in perfect mysteries. Mysteries are perfect. And the way he's getting into the understanding of the mysteries also, he's constantly perfecting himself. He is one trying to perfect himself and try to understand the mysteries perfectly. Then what happens to the man? A man in then alone becomes truly perfect. So if a man has to become perfect, he has to understand the mysteries perfectly. For that, he has to work perfectly, constantly perfecting himself. He has to perfect himself. He has to understand the mysteries perfectly. And then the man becomes a perfect person, is what Paedrus talked about. Paedrus. That's the only quotation, nothing more about that person. So this is how she has gone about. So HPP goes to talk now about Plato and the speculations in the symposium on the birth or creation of primordial man. So I'm just getting back so that we have better understanding of what we went through. It's a bit confusing because she talked about elemental spirits or elemental beings, and now she has switched on to Plato and the speculations of Plato and the symposiums he had with his disciples on the birth or creation of primordial men. Primordial men means the ancient or very, very early men. There is a book he wrote, Timus. The spelling of that is Timaeus, pronounced as Timus, where he did talk and mention about cosmogony. So actually, what we understand is he was supposed to give the details of men, the primordial men. But then the book he wrote, where he did talk and mention about cosmogony, means how the universe came into being. These words must be taken allegorically. This is the statement given by HPV. You cannot take them literally, but there is an allegorical meaning for it. If one wants to accept them, they have to be taken as allegorical statements. Plato and Neoplatonists, Plato and the people who followed him later, expounded the theory proposed by Pythagoras. Pythagoras brought out a theory which Plato and Neoplatonists, means people who followed Plato, disciples of Plato, they expounded the theory, means they took it forward and explained to everybody. What is the theory of Pythagoras? Pythagoras said, God is the universal mind. God is the universal mind, and that mind is diffused through all things. And he also added the dogma about the soul's immortality. There are two components to his Pythagoras theory. One talking about God itself. God is the universal mind, and that mind is diffused through all things and all beings. So that mind is universal and it is everywhere. The presence can be felt everywhere and everything. That is one part of the statement. Then he also added dogma about the soul's immortality. Soul is something which survives. There is no death to the soul, is what he said. So, all said and done, teachings were not derivative. Teachings were not derivative. They were not arranged in sequential order so that people can follow and understand them thoroughly, but incongruous, not in harmony with the subject. They were not properly kept in harmony with the subject, incongruous. Plato was piety and had great veneration. Plato is a person who is a pious intentions and had great veneration, means admiration or respect for the mysteries. He had a deep sense of responsibility. Plato had a deep sense of responsibility and did not become a victim of indiscretion. So he did not allow his discretion, did not fail him, in the sense he was very, very discreet. He did not reveal the secrets. So he did not become a victim of indiscretion. He behaved like an adept. He behaved like an adept and did not let go or publicize the secrets of the mysteries. He was unhappy that the secrecy about the mysteries was not maintained. Less secrecy is observed by others in the later years. Constantly perfecting himself in perfect mysteries, a man in them alone becomes truly perfect. Is a statement of Paedrus, Paedrus. Constantly perfecting himself. So if somebody is trying to bring perfection in his life and in perfect mysteries and trying to understand the mysteries which are very perfect, then a man then alone becomes truly perfect. So that's when he becomes a perfect man. First, he is perfecting himself. Then he's understanding the mysteries which are also perfect. Then that process is completed. He becomes truly perfect. That's what Peter said. Paedrus. That's the only quotation there, nothing more about that person. Plato wanted to share the secrets with the most worthy disciples of his. So that's what many people have done. We have seen in the study that people were not given en masse, everybody was not given all these secrets. Only people who the teacher had trust, only those people got the secrets. So Plato wanted to share the secrets with the most worthy disciples of his. So he chose his disciples and only to them he shared the secrets. With all the rest, maybe he has disciples, say, for example, 10, he only chose two. With those two, he shared the details. The rest of the 8 did not get the details. This is what it means. Plato wanted to share the secrets with the most worthy disciples of his. He took care to see that masses did not have access to those secrets. Why? What happens if they get access to the secrets? They will misuse it. That's the reason why the secrets are not given to masses. So Plato gave it to only worthy disciples of his. And masses did not have access to those secrets. Plato believed only in God, but he talked about gods. What does it mean? Plato believed in God. So he believed in the universal spirit or universal God, but he also talked about the smaller gods, the small g, Gods. The big God, capital G, is what he believed. Plato believed in God, but he talked about gods, Gods, which is made with the smaller g, which means divine beings who were of lesser stage than deities and but a great step higher than man. So these are the gods with which he was associated with. He did believe in the universal principle, which is God, but he also talked about gods. Where were they situated, in the sense, where were they in the hierarchy? Who were of the lesser stage than deities. Deities are above them. Deities means the divine beings or divine devatas are above them. But these gods are a grade or step higher than man. So men, gods, and then deities, and then universal God. That's perhaps the way in which he constructed his hierarchy. So the gods which he talked about were of lesser stage, means they are of lesser degree in competence when compared to deities, but a great step higher than usual men, ordinary men. This theory of God being the universal mind, diffused through all things, is part of all ancient philosophies. So this is everywhere, it's there. So what Pythagoras said, what Plato and Neoplatonists took and spread that, it's everybody accepts this. That's what the book is saying. That this theory, this particular theory of God being the universal mind, God being the universal mind, diffused through all things, is part of all ancient philosophies. All ancient philosophy says the same thing. Pythagoras also said the same thing. Plato and Plato's disciples or people who came after Plato also believed the same thing. So this is what the comment of HPB. This theory of God being the universal mind, diffused through all things, is part of all ancient philosophies. Buddhist tenets can be better understood when we study with the help of Pythagorean philosophy. This is what Madam is saying. Pythagorean philosophy is there, but Buddhist tenets, when you examine the Buddhist tenets with the help of Pythagorean philosophy, we can understand the Buddhic tenets. So Buddhist tenets, the tenets which are prescribed in the Buddhism, can be better understood when we study with the help of Pythagorean philosophy. So Pythagorean philosophy will aid in our understanding the Buddhist tenets. Tenets is principle. Almost all other religions of Christianity and Brahmanical are faithfully reflecting Pythagorean philosophy. So not only Buddhists, it's easy to understand because Buddhist tenets and Pythagorean philosophy are coexisting. Not only that, almost all other religions of Christianity and Brahmanical, means the Hindu, are faithfully reflecting Pythagorean philosophy. For example, similarities are pointed out. So all the similarities which are there in Pythagorean philosophy and the philosophy in Brahmanism, or the philosophy which is there in Christianity and Buddhist, are one and the same. Or there are a lot of similarities between the theories proposed by Pythagorean and Buddhist and Christian and Hindu. This is what that means. It's a universally accepted theory that God is universal mind and that God diffused through all things. So that is the thing. Buddha says, whosoever is ignorant of law. Buddha says, there's a lot of reference to Buddha and Buddhism now. Buddha says, whosoever is ignorant of law, if he dies, and that person will come back to earth to become perfect. This is what they say. Buddhists believe, whosoever is ignorant of law, that means he did not live a life adhering to the principles which have been pronounced in the great law. Buddhists believe whatever Lord Buddha said is a great law. If a man has not answered to the dictums of that great law, if a man has not followed the principles of the great law as pronounced by Lord Buddha, what happens to him? Buddha says, whosoever is ignorant of that great law, if he dies, suppose that person dies not following the great law, and that person who dies, who has not followed the great law, will come back to earth to become perfect. This is what we also say, that as long as there is need to get perfection, he comes back here to the earth, takes another birth, pays off all his debts which have incurred because of karma, and then seeks perfection, and then moves back again. So this is how even the Hindu system or Sanatana Dharma talks about. Buddha says, whosoever is ignorant of the great law, who is the author of the great law? Lord Buddha himself. So Buddha says, whosoever is ignorant of the great law, if he dies, and that person will come back to earth to become perfect. To achieve this, man should destroy the trinity of Maya. This is what the Buddhists believe. To achieve this, man should destroy the trinity of Maya. Maya, in its three aspects, have to be destroyed. Only then man can become perfect. To achieve this perfection by coming back to earth and adhering to the law, what he should be doing in the process is, to achieve this, man should destroy the trinity of Maya. Maya means illusion. This is an Indian term which we all, Hindu term which we understand very clearly. Shankara also spoke about Maya. Maya is illusion. That is Maya relating to body, astral. That is Maya relating to body and astral. The physical body and the astral body. There is a Maya relating to these two. It manifests on earth in astral and the Platonian dual soul. So this is what happens. Maya is illusion, that is Maya relating to the body, and astral. Having said that, it manifests on earth in astral and the Platonian dual soul. Plato had a theory of dual soul. So the astral and the dual soul, the two-pronged Platonian soul, is what it is taking birth. And a man should extinguish his passions. Okay.